Hey everyone, welcome back. I have a fascination with all things weird, mysterious, and creepy. I love doing deep dives on topics that I often stumble upon surely by chance, and I love to tell stories. So, welcome to Sit and Spin. If this is your first time joining us, I'm going to tell you a story while I spin using various fibers and techniques, which I will demonstrate on Thursdays before I post this on Fridays. You can join in or just watch and listen while we go on a journey. We'll explore history, conspiracy theories, the supernatural, basically anything that catches my interest and fascinates me. Now, these are stories of the internet, so I can't vouch for the validity of them. They're just fun to talk about. So, let's spin a yarn. Today we're chain plying our fiber braid from the Will Interrupted October 2020 fiber box. And we're going to talk about Halloween. Happy Halloween! We're going to look at some Halloween traditions and where they came from. We'll start with apples. Much to the chagrin of children looking for candy, apples have always had a large role in Halloween traditions. Since Halloween happens at the time of harvesting, this makes a bit of sense. But let's look at the specifics. Bobbing for apples is something that's not done as much these days, but it does have an interesting history. It was originally a courting ritual that was part of the Roman festival for Pomona, the goddess of agriculture and abundance. Youngsters believed they would be able to foretell their future relationships based on the game. The first person to bite an apple floating in water or alternately hanging from a string would be the first to be allowed to marry. A maiden who placed the apple she had bitten under her pillow was said to dream of her future husband. Sometimes the apples were assigned the names of partygoers, and the maidens would try to bite the apple of the man they wanted. If she got it on the first bite, they were definitely destined for romance. On the second bite, he would court her, but their love would fade. They should never have gone for the third bite, though, because if they succeeded, the relationship was doomed. There's tales of more violent traditions involving bobbing for apples. Druids of the British Isles would force villagers to bob apples from huge cauldrons of scalding liquid, or they could choose to be decapitated or thrown into a burning wicker man if they didn't want to bob those apples. There's not much proof this actually happened, and it would definitely make the Druids look like the bad guys. There is for sure, however, an Old Norse game called Snap Apple. An apple was speared on one end of a stick, and a lit candle was fixed to the other end. Then they would hang the stick from the ceiling and spin it. Participants would then try and take a bite of the apple while not getting their face burned. I'm pretty sure there was alcohol involved before this game began. So nowadays we have candy apples, and they came around because coating fruit in sugar syrup has been a way of preserving fruits for centuries. Pomona, the Roman goddess, was represented by apples, so they became the fruit to use during autumn celebrations. Let's go on to jack-o'-lanterns. They're another Halloween staple. The tradition originated in Ireland and Scotland, where lanterns represented spirits or supernatural beings and were used to ward off the evil spirits. The legend goes that Stingy Jack trapped the devil. There's so many versions of how he did this that no one knows which was the first. They are terribly amusing though, so look into it if you're looking for good Halloween stories. There's just too many of them for me to share. What they all agree on, though, is that after Stingy Jack trapped the devil, he wouldn't release him until the devil promised that Stingy Jack would never go to hell. with a name like Stingy Jack, well, when he died, he couldn't get into heaven either, so he was forced to roam the earth. The devil thought that was hilarious and gave Jack an eternally burning lump of coal to light his way as he wandered the earth. Jack carried the lump in a carved out turnip. This legend was used to explain will-o-wisps, the little lights they see when swamp matter decays. And because of this legend, in the British Isles, they used turnips, beets, and potatoes stuffed with coal, wood embers, or candles as lanterns to celebrate the fall harvest. As a prank, the kids would wander off the road with their lanterns and try to scare people into believing that they were Stingy Jack or maybe another lost soul. Over time, they started carving faces into the lanterns to make it look like floating heads, which sounds hilarious to me. When this tradition came to the New World, aka North America, there were pumpkins, which were much larger and made way better lanterns. And the jack-o'-lantern tradition continued. Just gotta adjust my wheel here. So it seems that all other Halloween traditions have their roots in Samhain, as it's spelled, but it's pronounced Samhain. This was an ancient Celtic celebration at the end of the harvest season, ushering in the dark half of the year. The Celts believed that the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin at this time and could be breached, allowing interactions between humans and spirits. They considered it the most important of the 4 quarterly fire festivals. At this time of year, hearth fires were allowed to burn out because everyone was busy in the fields doing the harvest. So after everything was brought in, the community would join the Druids, and they'd use a wheel that caused friction and sparked flames, a wheel that represented the sun, to spark a huge bonfire. Now, this bonfire led to the association of bats with Halloween, because of course the fire would attract the insects, and the insects would attract the bats. So that's where bats come into it, and they've become part of the traditional celebrations. The villagers would sacrifice cattle and a big party was had, and then everyone would take some flame from the communal bonfire to relight their home hearths that had gone out during the harvest. The celebration lasted 3 days, and it was mandatory to attend or you would be punished by the gods, likely with illness or death. It was such a sacred event that anyone who committed a crime or used a weapon during the celebrations faced a death sentence. So they were serious about this festival. Since the barrier between worlds was breachable during this time, there were rituals to prevent bad things from happening. They would prepare offerings of food and drink and leave them outside the village for the fairies. Not the Tinkerbell fairies, but the bad, evil fairies. But the villagers' ancestors could also visit during this time, and those were people they wanted to see. So they'd have a dummy and supper and invite their loved ones to join them in the eating, on condition they would leave after the meal. So they left their windows and doors open to facilitate entrance and exit. So what if you pissed someone off who died recently and you worried they'd be back to extract revenge during this time? Well, just dress as an animal or monster and they won't recognize you. This was also handy so the fairies would think you were one of them and not harm or kidnap you. There were creatures, of course, that roamed during Samhain, and the one I liked was the puka. The puka could take many forms. It was a very adept shapeshifter. It could be a goat, cow, horse, a hare, a cat, a dog. It could even look like people. But you could always tell if the puka was impersonating a person because they invariably retained an animal feature or two. Whatever they looked like, they did enjoy wandering off with children and never returning them. They were known to be very mischievous and they loved to harass weary travelers. And if they offered to take you for a ride, you had to comply. But it was kind of a good thing They'd take you on a wild ride, but the creature wouldn't harm you. To avoid encounters with the puka, people would leave offerings of something good and leave it far away from the village and the children just to be safe. To this day, some people still sprinkle grain in their yards to keep the puka happy on Halloween, believing if the puka is happy, your garden will overflow with fruit in the spring. So how did this celebration lead to trick-or-treating? Well, the Celts left food out to placate the ghosts and spirits traveling on that dark night, so people dressed as otherworldly beings could take that food and drink. A treat, if you will. But there are a couple of traditions that were likely part of the evolving modern tradition. The Scottish practice of guising involved children and poor adults going door to door, collecting food or money to say prayers for the dead on All Souls Day, which is November 1st. Later, guisers ditched the prayers and they began offering performances like jokes or songs, the tricks. There's also the German tradition of, okay, here we go, I can do this, Belsnickeling. I just like that word, Belsnickeling, where children dress in costumes and call on the neighbors to see if the adults can guess their identities. If no one can guess who they are, the children were rewarded and therefore trick or treat. Another tradition of Samhain and modern Halloween is the telling of tales. Nowadays, it's likely a horror story, but the Celts would tell the ancient myths of their people. They're complicated, confusing stories because the characters aren't readily known in our Western society, but I found one tale I could follow and understand, laid out beautifully on specifipedia.com. I'll include the link before, but I'm just going to read you the tale of the strange adventure of Nera, a traditional Celtic Halloween story. One ancient Samhain night, King Awill and Queen Meb of Connacht gathered their entire household, including warriors aplenty, at their fort, Rathcruachan. As the men were feasting, Awill made a strange request. One that sounded like a dare. The men had captured and executed 2 prisoners the day prior. Awill declared that whoever went and placed a willow branch around the foot of one of the corpses that hung fresh from the gallows would get a fantastic prize. No one wanted to take the bait. It was Samhain, after all, which meant the dead had power. A corpse could inflict untold damage on the living should it wish to. Eventually, a few volunteers rose to the challenge, heading off into the dark one by one. Each one made it only so far before scampering back because great was the darkness of that night and its horror. Finally, Nera offered to go. Awill promised his gold-hilt sword should Nera succeed. But Nera didn't just barge out of the fort toward the dead man. He took precautions. He donned a heavy suit of armor before heading out to the aptly named House of Tortures where the corpses were strung up. When Nera entered, his armor mysteriously fell off 3 times in a row. After putting it back on for the 3rd time, he heard one of the dead men cackle. He was doing it all wrong, the prisoner said. The armor needed a proper nail to hold it together. So Nera used a nail to secure his armor and to his flesh and hold everything together. The prisoner congratulated him, saying how brave he was. Arrogantly, Nera agreed. Side note, some accounts of the story have the willow branch spring off the prisoner's ankle 3 times rather than Nera's armor falling off. The warrior uses a peg to fasten the branch at the dead man's urging. Lo and behold, it works. After congratulating Nera, the prisoner egged him on. By the truth of thy valor, take me on thy neck, that I may get a drink with thee. I was very thirsty when I was hanged. Not one to be easily grossed out, Nera said, come on my neck then. Whither shall I carry thee? "The nearest house," replied the captive. So the two men, living and dead, went to the nearest house. Upon arrival, they saw that it was surrounded by a lake of fire. Realizing the people inside likely needed to use all their water to damp down the flames before bed, the prisoner decided they ought to try the next one. They crept toward another home, this one surrounded by a lake of water. "Do not go to that house," cried the captive. "There is never a washing nor bathing tub nor slop pail in it at night after sleeping." They continued to the third house. All seemed normal, and so they went inside. The occupants had left out vats for bathing and washing without dumping them. While the family slept, the dead man drank deeply from the vats. He then took his last mouthful and sprayed it over the sleeping people, killing them all instantly. Side note, this seems to be a fable on the dangers of not keeping a clean house. Just saying. Apparently unfazed, Nera took the prisoner back to the gallows and returned to the royal fort. What he saw when he got there shocked him. The entire hill on which the fort sat was aflame, and resting in the foreground was a giant pile of heads belonging to his fellow soldiers. Dumbstruck, Nera noticed another army moving away and followed them as they sank deeper into the mound, or Cid, they were marching on. Suddenly, everything changed. In that moment, Nera realized he had left the earth and entered the strange other world, one that bordered the realm of the living. The Cid warriors had brought the heads along and displayed their trophies to their king upon arrival. The king was pleased. "What shall be done to that man who came with?" a warrior asked, gesturing towards Nera. "Let him come hither that I might speak with him," the mighty ruler replied. The king gave Nera explicit instructions. He was to go to a woman's house where he would be allowed to live as long as he brought a piece of firewood to the king every day. When he arrived, the woman received him cordially, and Nera faithfully brought the king a burden of firewood each day. One day, Nera noticed a blind man with a lame man on his back leaving the palace and climbing over a wall. Bemused, he asked the woman what it meant. "They are going over to the crown that's in the wall," the woman explained. "It is a gold diadem that the king wears on his head, and that is where it is hidden." Puzzled, Nera asked why they went in twos. "That's easy," replied the woman, who explained that the king would only trust a man who can't see and one who can't walk to visit his cherished possessions. Neither could ever betray him. Nera then wondered aloud about his own destiny. The woman, by this time keen on the noble warrior, decided to divulge a secret. She revealed that the fire and the mountain of severed heads was a prophetic vision that hadn't yet happened. You see, time passed differently down in the Cid. If only Nera could warn his people, they would be saved. Oh, and by the way, she was also pregnant. "Rise and go to them," said she, as though she didn't just drop a bomb. "They are still around the same cauldron, and the charge has not yet been removed from the fire. Tell them to be on their guard on the evening of Samhain coming, and to destroy the Cid." She added that he must send her a message before his people destroyed it, so she could escape with his future son and their livestock. And so Nera returned to the fortress to find everything as it was, with his fellow soldiers gathered round the cauldron and the king and queen holding court. He received Awil's golden sword and proceeded to regale them all with his adventures, finishing off with a dire warning. A year passed, and when the time came, Awil urged Nera to go back to the Cid and remove his family so that the rest could be destroyed. He returned to find his wife, son, and a massive amount of cattle waiting for him. And I have reached the end of my fiber. So I will grab my nitty naughty and we shall see what we have. 1 second. All right, I have my nitty naughty so we can unwind our chain-plied yarn. And I will continue the story. Where were we? He returned to find his wife's son and a massive amount of cattle waiting for him. She had been carrying firewood to the king every day in his stead. Now at this point in the story, a lot of other characters and plot lines come into play, but for the sake of expediency, we're going to focus on Nera. The tale ends with the men of Connacht destroying the Cid people and taking what they pleased from it, including the crown of Brian, a very powerful item. Meanwhile, Nera returned with his wife and son to the unoccupied Cid. From then on, they lived together in the fairy world, surrounded by great treasures and precious things, with garments and food aplenty. And Nera stayed there until forever and would not come out until doomsday. So that's my quick look at the traditions of Halloween. Now get in your costume and celebrate. Here's what our chain-plied yarn looks like. And I hope you too enjoyed a good yarn, and I'll see you next week.